What's up, everybody? Welcome to Heresy Financial. My name is Joe Brown, and it looks like the markets might be starting to recover. The S&P 500, Dow, Russell 2000 market indexes were up 7 to 8% today. People are talking about the virus may be peaking soon. There's an infrastructure spending plan that is being tossed around, and people are saying the bailout might have worked. So have they successfully kicked the can down the road yet again with this massive monetary expansion? I think you know my answer, but let's dive in. Okay, in short, no. And I've been hearing a lot of talk about this lately, like, hey, they've kicked the can down the road again, especially from people who don't necessarily agree with monetary and fiscal response and the massive amount of bailouts, and Federal Reserve is monetizing a lot of debt right now, expanding their balance sheet. But even from people who agree with that that's a bad idea, are saying, hey, it looks like they've been able to kick the can down the road yet again, a repeat of 12 years ago. Have they been able to delay the inevitable collapse one more time? And so if we don't even look at the unemployment numbers, which are much higher than they were, and they're by a lot of estimates only beginning the unemployment numbers, the jobless claims. And if we don't look at the fact that social habits from this event are going to be drastically changed compared to the fact that social habits really weren't changed that much, other than maybe people's attitudes towards home buying. We're going to have a lot of social distancing, a lot more fear for a long time with things like travel, flying, hotels, social gatherings. We've already had a massive wiping out of individuals' savings from things like having to try and prepare for accumulating food for a potential shortage. People blowing through their savings because they were the ones that got their hours cut, their pay cut, or their actual job was cut. And the debt exploding too from everybody doing those same exact things, but the people who didn't already have a pile of savings, they just, maxed out their credit cards. So even if we ignore all of those differences and how those show that we're in a much worse position than we were 11, 12 years ago, there's one factor that is the biggest key in why this is not just going to be a repeat of kicking the can down the road again, and it's central banks. The fact of the matter is that 12 years ago, we really caught the world off guard and caught most central banks flat-footed, and the world was very dependent on the dollar system. And so central banks around the world bailed us out and bought treasuries from the United States. And when I say buy treasuries, for anybody who's not really familiar with what that means, all that means is that the central banks around the world printed money to loan the United States money. When you buy a treasury, you're loaning money to the United States government. And so the world bailed us out, and they said, hey, we'll allow you to, print all this money, go into debt. We'll loan you that money so that you can basically bail out the American economy, because the rest of the world was so dependent on the United States economy. And that is simply not happening anymore. For the last couple of years, the last 5 years, but especially the last 1 to 2 years, most central banks around the world have prepared to do away with the dollar. And that is very evident because the world, for the first time, has flipped from being a net buyer of treasuries. Central banks around the world are no longer net buyers of treasuries. They're net sellers of treasuries. And again, what that means is that central banks around the world, they're no longer loaning money to the United States government. What that means is that they're actively getting rid of the debt that they do hold. And if all of the central banks around the world are dumping US debt, who's the buyer? The Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is the only buyer of treasuries, and they're printing money to do that. And the fact that they've opened up all these facilities and programs to buy US Treasury debt from everyone, and companies and countries and central banks all around the world, means that they're in panic mode to try and buy up these treasuries as fast as possible, because they know the rest of the world is dumping them. Now, if you have treasuries being sold off and nobody's coming in to buy them at artificially inflated prices, that makes the price of the debt go down, which makes the yield, the amount of interest they pay, goes up. And if yields go up on existing treasuries, the only way for the United States government to issue more debt and have people loan them money would be to match the interest rate that their current debt is being sold for. Otherwise, who would buy United States government debt that's new debt when they can buy old debt that pays a higher interest? So the only way for the United States government to continue to issue more debt is to match the interest rate on the current existing stockpile of treasuries. Okay, so this is very important. The vast majority of the United States government debt is short-term debt. It's short dated, meaning it has to be continually rolled over. because they never pay it off. They just pay off the old debt by issuing new debt. And so if yields go up, and it gets more expensive to get new debt. Like if your credit card rate goes up, it gets more expensive for you to just transfer that balance to a new credit card. Your payments go up just because the interest goes up, even though your balance didn't change. And so number one, if the interest rates on treasury debt go up too much, the United States government cannot afford to make those interest payments. So they need to keep rates down just to afford the interest rates on their current load of debt. Number two, they need to continue to take out new debt to pay off their old debt. Number three, we're witnessing an implosion of tax revenue. That means taxes are just imploding right now, which means that they're not getting any new revenue to pay off their old debt. The only way they're able to pay off their old debt and to continue financing their existing spending is to take on even more debt than what they need just to pay off the old debt. Now, normally in a situation like this, that would indicate inflation is likely, because when the government steps in to spend a massive amount of money, takes out a bunch of debt to inject money into their economy, you're likely to see prices rise. It's an inflationary policy. And so rates would rise naturally to accommodate the debt holders for their purchasing power being eroded over time. So that's part of the free market. People are trying to sell those bonds because they're not worth it. It's not worth it to hold on to a 1% or a 2% yield when inflation might be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10%. You're losing money. Now, the only way you're willing to hold on to debt is if you're at least getting the same amount back in interest as you're giving up in purchasing power over the time that you're holding that loan. But treasuries don't operate in a free market system. The Federal Reserve can print as much money as they want to buy up these treasuries as they get sold off. They're the only buyer left pretty much of treasuries, and everybody else is selling them. What that means is that there's no natural mechanism that the government is allowing to happen to rein in inflation. Normally it would be interest rates. Now the financial experts out there, the pundits, say, hey, there's no concern with inflation because the moment we smell a sniff of high inflation, we can just let rates go and we can control that inflation and rein it back in at the snap of our fingers. But that's not true. That would make the United States government default on their debt. They can't afford higher rates, especially with the amount of debt that's starting to explode right now. With the amount of the deficits, the increase in spending, and the fall in revenue, there's no way the United States government can afford to have rates go up. And so the only thing the Federal Reserve can do is to print money in order to accommodate more and more debt. So even if inflation starts to take off, they're not going to rein that inflation in. Essentially what you have here is that we're looking at the fundamental laws of money. And the fundamental laws of money state that you can't actually spend more money than you make. At some point, it has to be paid for, whether that's paid by you or by somebody else. And a lot of times when it's paid for in a sneaky way, and it's paid for by stealing purchasing power from the existing stockpile of wealth. Now, normally that's done through taxation, but in the case of printing money, that's done through inflation, and most people just don't realize it until it's too late. So the bottom line is inflation didn't really happen last time as much as we thought it might because the rest of the world bailed us out. They're not doing that this time. In fact, they're actively doing the opposite by selling treasuries. And so not only are we not able to export that inflation to central banks in foreign countries like we did last time, but they're sending it all back. And the final kicker is, what do you think all of these countries around the world are going to do once they're able to liquidate their treasuries? Well, they're not holding on to treasuries anymore because they need to spend money. And if they're selling treasuries to get dollars to spend, where do you think all these dollars are going to end up once they've spent them? Those dollars eventually come back to the States. And whether that's in the form of purchasing our goods and services, whether that's in the form of purchasing our assets, at some point those dollars come back because they're not holding treasuries anymore. They're certainly not going to be holding on to our dollars. And so no, we can't kick the can down the road anymore. The world is not bailing us out like they did last time. We can't escape the fundamental laws of money. This wealth is actually being destroyed, confiscated to the government from the people. It's just being done very sneakily through monetary expansion, through inflation, and by the time everybody realizes it, it's going to be too late. So don't get caught flat-footed, prepare for it because inflation is coming. Thank you so much for watching. You guys have a great day.